Hello, and welcome to our next lecture in physiological psychology. Today we're going to be talking about fear and aggression. Oftentimes, fear and aggression are associated with escape behaviors in animals, which would be fear, and aggression is associated with attack behaviors in animals. So oftentimes in the literature or in text, you'll see people talk about escape and attack behaviors. We're going to talk about them from fear and aggression because that's the human part of this equation. So we'll start by talking about aggression. And aggression we will break down into a few subtopics. We'll first talk about hormones and aggression because this seems to be one of the areas where there's a great deal of interest and a great deal of speculation about how hormones might affect aggression. We'll then talk about neural mechanisms of aggression, and then finally talk a little bit about heredity and environmental effects on aggression. So primarily, aggression is associated with testosterone and other androgens. Androgens are sort of the whole group of masculine hormones like testosterone, androstenodine, dehydroepiandrosterone is a weak androgen. In animals, aggression is often associated with reproductive behaviors, and as such, testosterone appears to play a role. So, for example, in a lot of animal species, males will be involved in aggressive behaviors toward other males to try to become the dominant male as part of a herd or as part of a group, or to run off other potential suitors. And that seems to be associated oftentimes with testosterone levels. We also know that in both animals and humans, males tend to be more physically aggressive. Certainly there's a huge difference between a bull and a heifer. Bulls are much more aggressive than heifers, which are female cows. And in humans, we see males tend to be much more likely to be incarcerated, much more likely to be involved in physical altercations. And so oftentimes there is this association between sex and aggression. Now, one of the important things to understand about this is males are more physically aggressive. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are more aggressive. We'll talk in a little bit about how females can be aggressive without being physically aggressive. So verbally aggressive, there is still aggression in both sexes. Males tend to be more physically aggressive. There is conflicting evidence regarding the role of testosterone in human males. It's not entirely clear that increasing testosterone is associated with physical aggression in human males. There are weak associations with violent crime. Your textbook talks a little bit about those. There is evidence that aggression may be related to testosterone-cortisol ratios. That is, males with high levels of testosterone but low levels of cortisol apparently are associated with the highest levels of aggression. It appears that cortisol may dampen aggression, and so males with high testosterone and high cortisol appear to have lower levels of aggression because of the dampening effects of cortisol. So of course cortisol is released in response to stress, so high stress males may be less aggressive than lower stress males, but of course these are generalizations and any one person may respond differently, and the results in this area are not as clean as we might want them to be. There is some evidence that testosterone-mediated aggression may be related to competition for limited resources, what we call a competitive challenge. So in animals, we're talking about competition for limited food resources, limited mating resources, and it may be, and this is just me speculating, that some of the mixed results in aggression in males associated with testosterone may have to do with the prevailing economic climate. That is, when there are rough economic times, so in economic crises, we might see increased aggression that's associated with testosterone because of those limited economic resources. And there's ample evidence to indicate that these kind of economic crises result in all kinds of differing behaviors. So people tend to treat outsiders very differently during these crises. People tend to be much more xenophobic during these kind of economic crises. So this may be part of this question. Finally, women with higher levels of androstenodine, which is a weak androgen, but is one of the more potent androgens that is circulating in women. Women with higher levels of androstenodine show higher levels of verbal aggression. And so this is where we get at this question of what we mean by aggression. Physical aggression is very different from things like verbal aggression, but in this study they showed that women with higher levels of androstenodine show higher levels of verbal aggression. Now, androstenodine is a steroid precursor primarily, and so it can be aromatized into testosterone and eventually estrogens, but it is one of the primary androgens for women, and so what we see is androgens are again associated with higher levels of verbal aggression. Other hormones we see and their involvement in aggression are less clear and less investigated. It appears that higher levels of estrogen are associated with decreased competitiveness in women. So women with higher levels of estrogen report less competitiveness in sports, are less likely to compete in sports. And finally, administration of oxytocin may decrease aggression in males. And it's something we'll talk more about here in a bit when we talk about fear and the role of the amygdala in fear and aggression, because oxytocin decreases amygdala activity. And the next place to talk about aggression are the neural mechanisms of aggression. We'll first talk about the types of aggression, because there are sort of reactive aggressions and sort of plotting intentional aggressions. We'll talk about aggression in the autonomic nervous system, the neural circuits for aggression, and then finally talk about drugs and aggression. So reactive aggression is the first type of aggression we'll talk about. It's more impulsive. These are things like fistfights with strangers who bump into you, people that just react aggressively. They can result in sudden, heightened, enduring, and inappropriate aggressive responses. This seems to be mediated mostly by sort of the subcortical primal systems. This is a sort of instinctive reaction, if you will, so less governed by the more contemplative cortex. Instrumental aggression is more purposeful and goal-oriented, thought to be regulated by higher cortical systems and less dependent on these primitive hypothalamic and limbic systems. So instrumental aggression is more like plotting. When we see people who do mass shootings, that's kind of plotting. People who engage in terrorism, people who engage in robbery to gain money. This is the kind of instrumental aggression that's more purposeful and supposedly has some sort of goal. And so this is very different from reactive aggression. The autonomic nervous system is, of course, closely tied in with aggression. These kind of intermittent explosive disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, and depression-linked aggression, which tend to be these more reactive aggression, are associated with increased autonomic nervous system arousal, which can contribute to these kind of uncontrolled reactive aggression. These are all associated with increased cortisol levels, increased autonomic nervous system levels, and so people are tense, and they're much more likely to react in an aggressive way. Individuals with antisocial personality disorder or conduct disorder actually show lower autonomic nervous system responsiveness because this blunts their typical emotional responses, because their autonomic nervous system is responding less. They have lower emotional responses. They're not as quick to anger or to think about the long-term consequences of the emotional effects of their actions, and so this can increase instrumental aggression. So that blunted autonomic nervous system responsiveness can be associated with things like antisocial personality disorder. Now, the underlying neural circuits for aggression are not well defined, but we do know the frontal lobes exhibit a top-down ability to inhibit aggression. And this is really important because we sort of all have primitive responses that are automatic and much more based in fear and aggression. Our frontal lobes are one of the things that separate us. And so our ability to control that is an important part of who we are as social creatures. And so the frontal lobes exhibit this top-down ability to inhibit that implicit aggressive response. We know that damage to the frontal cortex has been linked to increases in aggression. So people who have frontal lobe damage, oftentimes people have traumatic brain injury, oftentimes show increases in aggression. Certainly the classic case of Phineas Gage, who had severe damage to the frontal cortex, was associated with an increase in aggression. We see higher reactive aggression being associated with lower baseline activity in the frontal cortex. So individuals who have a lower baseline activity in fMRI scans of their frontal cortex show much higher reactive aggression. And so the frontal cortex, if it's not responding at its appropriate levels, is not able to inhibit that kind of reactive aggression. That frontal cortex provides inhibitory inputs to circuits in the hypothalamus and the amygdala, which are associated with this kind of aggression. So it's exerting this top-down control over this kind of reactive aggression and keeping it in check. And so if that is diminished by injury or other issues, then we get increases in this kind of aggression that's associated with the hypothalamus and the amygdala. One of the interesting things about this is D-amphetamine, which is Adderall, has been shown to increase this kind of top-down control in ADHD, conduct disorder children, and brain-injured adults, and this results in decreased aggression. The amphetamine is increasing activity in the frontal cortex and exerting a greater top-down control. And this is one of the reasons why Ritalin and Adderall are able to correct ADD and ADHD in children and reduce this kind of aggression in brain-injured adults by increasing this kind of top-down control. The amygdala, of course, is important for all of our emotional responses, but particularly this kind of primal aggressive emotion. Individuals with intermittent explosive personality disorder show increased activation in the amygdala in response to angry faces. Amygdala activation is positively associated with a lifetime history of aggression. So there's a scale that measures your sort of lifetime history of aggression, and these people show in fMRI studies increased amygdala activation. Intranasal administration of oxytocin shows reduced fear activity in the amygdala, and this may be a potential way to reduce aggression, which has been shown in animals. So if you reduce fear, you can potentially reduce amygdala, because the two are intimately related, which is why we're talking about these in the same lecture. Oxytocin is an unusual substance. It's really difficult to administer, and intranasal administration appears to be the most efficient way to do so. It's certainly not available in any sort of pill form. One of the important neural circuits for aggression involves the 5-HT and serotonin pathways. As discussed in your text, serotonin clearance, which refers to the ability for, serotonin turnover, refers to how much serotonin the brain of an individual is using and going through. And we know that individuals who are high in aggression show decreased serotonin turnover. We also see individuals who are high in aggression have been shown to have lower prefrontal cortex activation, but these individuals, after 12 weeks of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are your basic antidepressants, they show reduced feelings of aggression. Taking and building on this research, in a group of borderline personality disorder patients, they demonstrated that after 12 weeks of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor treatment, they showed reduced aggression and increased prefrontal cortex activity, and that prefrontal cortex activity was negatively associated with aggression. So the more prefrontal cortex activity we saw, the lower we get in aggression. So this demonstrates that there is a strong case for this 5-HT receptor serotonin pathway being involved in this top-down control of aggression from the prefrontal cortex. I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the few different drugs and how they've been shown to influence aggression. First and foremost, drugs are most likely to invoke aggression in those who are already predisposed to aggression. Most drugs are going to build on who you are when you show up to the party, so to speak. So certainly alcohol is like that, and other drugs are as well. Alcohol is certainly the worst drug offender in causing aggression, and I think many of us have experiences with friends who suddenly go from jovial and fun-loving to overly aggressive. This seems to be the result of alcohol's effect on GABA channels. So GABA is a GABA aminobutyric acid. It's an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and alcohol increases the effects of GABA. And it appears that this GABA modulation can increase aggression. And we certainly see that in alcohol, and we see that as well in benzodiazepines. These drugs are also GABA agonists, and we'll talk more about these in a bit when we talk about anxiety. But they may heighten effects of aggression through interference in the anxiety threat detection system. So we may misread threats and as a result be more aggressive. The major thing to know about this is there are large individual differences in terms of how people respond, and importantly there's a dose-response relationship. And that is, at low levels, benzodiazepines do not increase aggression and may decrease it. It appears it's at these intermittent levels that they may increase aggression, and then the high levels they decrease aggression, but at that point pretty much everyone's sedated and probably mostly asleep. It's important to note these two drugs have significant interactions and are certainly not something I would recommend because they affect the same neurotransmitter system and can have sort of magnifying effects on one another. One of the most interesting parts of this story are psychostimulants, drugs like cocaine and amphetamines. These drugs have a reputation for being associated with aggression and inducing aggression. But there is little evidence to support this idea that they cause aggression. In fact, in laboratory studies, very few people become aggressive when using these drugs. Clinical studies, lots and lots of studies on this, and it appears that one of the reasons why we see aggression with these drugs has to do with the people who are more likely to take them. So people who are more aggressive tend to be more sensation-seeking and are more likely to actually use and abuse these substances. And as a result, it's aggressive people that use these drugs and not that they cause aggression. Certainly we see more instrumental aggression in these individuals as they try to get money to afford their habit, and that's simply involved in trying to get money. But in terms of primarily affecting aggression, they don't really appear to have that effect except in people who are already aggressive. And then finally, marijuana is really mostly associated with decreased aggression. In fact, many places that have legalized marijuana have found decreases in violent crime, and the only increases you see oftentimes are related around marijuana businesses trying to get at their cash. And so you actually see decreases in these kind of reactive, aggressive responses because people who are on marijuana simply don't respond that way. Finally, I want to talk a little bit, I wanted to highlight a couple of issues in this question of heredity and environmental effects on aggression. There are certainly some gene-environment interactions, and I simply wanted to provide you with one illustration. There are two known genotypes for coding monoamine oxidase, which is something we've talked about previously, and this is monoamine oxidase A, so it's MAOA, which is an enzyme involved in metabolism of catecholamines like dopamine and serotonin. Individuals who are born with the short form of this gene, and thus have lower levels of MAOA, are more likely to show conduct disorders if they were raised in an abusive environment. This is one of these areas that shows this clear gene-environment interaction. So the studies show that people with this gene, if they're raised in a healthy, loving environment, don't show increased aggression. But if they are raised in an abusive environment, they're much more likely to be aggressive. And so there are all these interesting questions about how genes and environment interact and how the effects of environment might alter genetic expression, something we've talked about previously. And this is one of those areas that clearly demonstrates that. The other area I wanted to talk about are how vicarious aggression, which is watching other aggression, can have biological effects. So for example, sports fans, testosterone levels can rise and fall with their team's wins and losses. And in fact, this has been demonstrated to be associated with aggression. There have been a number of studies that show that domestic violence increases after a sport team loss. which may be associated with aggression or with frustration. Children with high exposure to violent video games and television programs show reduced activity in these frontal areas that we have been discussing that potentially have this kind of top-down control over those aggressive subcortical areas. So watching aggressive acts by others can actually alter our physiology, and I think that's a really important lesson and something we really need to think strongly about and spend some more time investigating. So I want to turn next to talking about fear and anxiety. Fear and anxiety play important roles. We're supposed to be afraid. People who aren't afraid have a difficult time functioning because they don't know when they're supposed to be afraid. It's a basic survival mechanism. So I want to talk first about the role of the amygdala. It seems to be really the most important part of the brain involved in our fear responses. Talk a little bit about anxiety disorders, and then talk about how we can get some relief from anxiety. One of the first things to note with the role of the amygdala is what we call the startle reflex. Loud noises and other surprises can induce the startle reflex, and this starts when we are infants. Certainly loud noises induce this kind of startle in everyone. Many people like myself startle very easily, and that's associated with anxiety, which we'll talk about in a moment. But there's a direct neural pathway associated with this startle reflex. Auditory information travels from the medulla to the pons, which then causes an immediate muscle contraction, which is that jump that you feel when you have this kind of startle. And the startle reflex is a behavioral measure of anxiety, which makes this rather unusual in terms of how we think about investigating emotions, because most emotions we don't have an objective measure of. We simply have to ask people what they're feeling. But we know when someone startles because we can measure their muscle changes objectively, or we can see it. And we know that people who have high levels of anxiety are much more likely to startle, and their startle responses are much more vigorous. And I can tell you from a personal perspective that I'm a relatively anxious person, and I startle incredibly easy. I have scared myself. I once saw my own reflection in a hotel room and jumped about 2 feet. And so this is a genuine effect of looking at how anxiety and this kind of reflex are associated. Some interesting work has come out of looking at damage to the amygdala, and I kind of cut this down a bit in terms of looking at the whole field, because it is complicated in terms of where there's damage to the amygdala. But generally, damage to the amygdala results in decreased fear conditioning. We see this in animals, and decreased fear learning in humans, or decreased fear responses in humans. So this is a rare condition with pretty extensive damage to the amygdala, and the few patients that have been shown with this show really absolutely almost no fear, to the point that people actually have to be stopped. Don't pick up that poisonous snake. And so the amygdala is really important for this kind of fear response. I want to spend just a few minutes talking about toxoplasmosis. This is a parasite associated with cats. It only reproduces sexually in cats. It will just simply divide like any other germ in any other host. So this parasite, Toxoplasma gondii, infects rats and then targets the amygdala such that the rats no longer fear cats or the smell of cat urine, and so are much more likely to be susceptible to being eaten by a cat. This is really a fascinating symbiotic relationship. Cats carry this parasite, which makes them more able to capture rats and makes it so that they can pass on this parasite. What's important to know about this is it's not just rats that are infected. People get infected by toxoplasmosis. So people with cats, about half of the human population has this parasite. And it targets the brain of humans and has been associated with effects on the amygdala, and some really surprising results can happen. So last year, the study came out that showed increased sexual adventurousness in people who had cats, and particularly people who were infected with toxoplasmosis. Increased interest in things like bondage. So this decreased fear of different kinds of sex seems to be associated with that. The other thing that is associated with toxoplasmosis is an increased risk for mental illness, particularly in infants of women who are infected with toxoplasmosis. In fact, pregnant women are advised to avoid interaction with cats, in particular with the litter box. In terms of functional magnetic resonance imaging studies of the amygdala, we see fMRI studies show the amygdala responds strongly to photos that arouse fear or photos of faces showing fear. The response is stronger when the meaning is unclear and requires some processing. So essentially, the amygdala is involved in resolving that emotional ambiguity of what's happening in that face. Interestingly, the amygdala responds more strongly to an angry face that's directed away from the viewer and frightened faces directed towards the viewer. So we can see in these faces, if you see the direct looking directly at you, we get less response from the amygdala than anger that is averted towards a different location. Direct fear is associated with higher activation than fear that is averted. From just sort of an analytical perspective, this is an interesting puzzle. It makes sense that the amygdala would be respond if somebody's looking at you with fear. That means they're trying to communicate to you, I'm afraid. Whereas anger that's averted somewhere else might signal that there's danger somewhere else. So both of these seem to be danger signals. This looking at us directly with anger seems to me to indicate that this kind of interpersonal conflict anger is less associated with the amygdala than potential danger from somewhere else. And so, anyway, that's sort of my 2 cents on this idea. I want to finish this up by talking about anxiety disorders. The most severe of these is panic disorder, along with PTSD. But panic disorder is characterized by frequent periods of anxiety, occasional attacks of rapid breathing, increased heart rate, sweating, and trembling. These panicked attacks are essentially an extreme arousal of the sympathetic nervous system. And so it essentially causes this fight or flight response. This appears to be linked to some abnormalities in the hypothalamus, not the amygdala, so it appears to be more hypothalamic. And there appears to be somewhat of a genetic component. Panic attacks are easier to induce in first-degree relatives of people who have panic attacks. This is generally induced by having the first-degree relative breathe carbon dioxide, which is kind of like a smothering response, and that can induce a panic attack. And I know I have some tendency to panic attacks, and I have first-degree relatives that do as well. But that kind of covering my face or breathing my own exhaled breath will cause me to panic really quickly. I can't wear masks, and I'm sure some of you are like that as well. And so that indicates this kind of genetic component of panic attacks. Post-traumatic stress disorder is certainly something we have a great deal of interest in. This, of course, has a variety of etiologies. It's mostly associated with war, but also associated with people who are victims of intense personal crimes, rape, incest, that sort of thing. It's marked by frequent distressing recollections and nightmares about the traumatic event, avoidance of reminders, and vigorous reactions to noises and other stimuli. So this kind of hypervigilance and over-remembering are the major components of this. What's really of particular interest right now is trying to figure out who is more at risk for PTSD. So potentially we can either deploy individuals who are more at risk less, or come up with treatments so before they go to deploy they're less at risk, to try to figure out sort of who's more at risk for this disorder, because not everyone that goes to battle comes back with PTSD, and not everyone that is a victim of a crime has PTSD. Well, studies have shown that reduced hippocampal volume may be associated with susceptibility to PTSD. And in this particular study, they looked at identical twins sharing the same genome, monozygotic twins, and they showed that when one twin has PTSD following a trip to a war zone and the other has not been to battle, they both show smaller hippocampi. Well, the fact that the other twin has smaller hippocampi indicates that it's not the battle that has been associated with that, but some sort of genetic predisposition. And so there's something involved with that physiology that we need to resolve. And then finally, there's evidence that Vietnam War veterans who have brain damage to the amygdala showed no PTSD, but individuals with other brain damage with no amygdala damage, 40% of them show PTSD. So certainly there is some association with brain damage not involving the amygdala and post-traumatic stress disorder. Final place to stop in this is, how do we get relief from anxiety? Well, there are a number of non-pharmacological ways. We're going to talk about the pharmacological ways because they're tied most closely with physiology. But there is emerging evidence that meditation, integrated mind-body therapy may provide relief from anxiety. Increase in exercise, social interactions are appropriate for relieving from anxiety. But I want to talk about the underlying physiology and how it relates to drugs that affect anxiety. And the primary drugs in this area are benzodiazepines. Benzodiazepines are drugs like Xanax, Ativan, Valium, Transine, Klonopin. All of these are benzodiazepine sedatives. Other drugs like Ambien are related to benzodiazepines, but have less anxiolytic effect and more sedative effects. Well, these all influence the action of GABA. Sorry, I left out an A on there. And GABA is, of course, gamma-aminobutyric acid. So we have here a GABA receptor. If you look at this cross-section, it has on it a benzodiazepine receptor and a GABA receptor. The two work together to open this channel to allow chloride ions to infiltrate the neuron, which of course hyperpolarizes the cell. So by allowing those chloride ions to infiltrate the cell, we have increased the polarization of the cell, making it harder for an action potential to be generated. This is where we get back to these first principles about how an action potential is generated and its effects on things like anxiety. So these drugs reduce the firing of neurons and have effects in a variety of areas, but certainly subcortical areas involved in anxiety, reducing anxiety. They also reduce respiration and other effects as well. So benzodiazepines are anxiolytic by reducing neural firing by increasing GABA, which is that inhibitory neurotransmitter, and they exert their effects on anxiety via the amygdala, the hypothalamus, midbrain, hippocampus, and other areas. Benzodiazepines have a wide variety of potency and effects and half-lives and all sorts of other issues. They're all very different. Xanax is the most commonly prescribed. I myself take it on occasion. I take 1/4 milligram, the lowest dose there is. There are people who have taken it for decades and take 3 and 5 milligrams, which is a huge dose. One of the most important things to understand about these drugs is if they are taken on a daily basis, they have very potent biological addiction properties, and people who take them daily cannot suddenly go off them. There have been a number of cases in jail facilities where inmates have been denied access to these prescriptions and they've died because of it. These drugs should never be taken on a daily basis. If they are, they can't be stopped all of a sudden, because that's very dangerous. One of the things I want to note, because you see that the hippocampus is involved in the actions of these drugs, they all have negative effects on memory encoding. Anytime someone is under the influence of these drugs, their memory will be impoverished. The sort of granddaddy of them all in terms of memory is midazolam, which is also known as Versed. It's given to people when they come in for procedures, primarily so they don't remember what happens. And it will completely keep them from encoding their memories. The others have sort of greater and lesser effects depending on their dose and the person. The final thing I want to note is they do decrease respiration. They're generally safe, and they're able to be completely reversed with a drug called flumazenil, but they should never be combined with alcohol, because alcohol has the same effect on GABA receptors, and the two together combine to cause some pretty significant effects, and certainly blackouts are not uncommon. That gets us to alcohol. Alcohol exerts GABA agonist action. It has been shown to alleviate anxiety, and we know that people often self-medicate with alcohol. So it can reduce anxiety, but certainly that's a slippery slope. Relieving your nerves with a glass of wine is one thing. Drinking to constantly try to medicate your anxiety is another. I want to finally note there is this really fascinating new work in eliminating fear responses, and there's a group of investigators who have been able to remove the fear response in people who are phobic, particularly in this case arachnophobic, who are afraid of spiders. This is a terrific frontline video called Memory Hackers, where they actually show this in place, so I really recommend taking a look at it. But essentially what they've done is patients come in and they interact with a tarantula spider, and these are people who are deeply arachnophobic, and you can see it in the patient they show in this video I was mentioning. After they interact with the spider, they're given propranolol, which blocks beta-noradrenergic receptors after they've interacted with the spider. What happens is, this has to do more with memory than with anxiety, but they're related, and it's important because this isn't deleting a memory, this is disconnecting the fear from the memory. And so what happens is, when their brains reconsolidate their memory under the effects of the propranolol, that adrenaline response is disconnected, so that fear is disconnected. And what's fascinating is you can see in the people who come back, they remember being afraid of the spider, but the fear is no longer there. And so it has disconnected that phobic response. And so this shows us that certainly there is a noradrenergic response in terms of this phobia, and it also shows that our memories, every time we have an experience, we can reconsolidate a memory. All right, well, that wraps up our discussion of fear and anxiety and aggression. Next up, we'll be talking about stress and the HPA response axis.